Lately, I've been thinking about something that feels a lot more important than I first realized. Not progress, not results, not momentum, protection. Because when you're building something over a long period of time, especially when the visible payoff is still small, the danger is not always that you suddenly quit. At least for me, that's not usually how it works. I don't tend to wake up one morning and think, that's it, I'm done. What happens is quieter than that, more subtle, more dangerous. I keep going, but I care less. Hi, I'm JP, and I've realized that one of the biggest threats in this season is discouragement. Not because discouragement makes me want to walk away completely, but because it can make me show up with less heart, less sharpness, and less conviction than what this build actually deserves. And that matters, because right now there are two things I feel especially protective of: my discipline and my faith. Because if either of those starts quietly weakening, then everything else weakens with it. I think discouragement is dangerous, partly because it rarely announces itself properly. It doesn't always come as some dramatic emotional collapse. It doesn't always look like burnout. It doesn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it just sounds like this: what's the point? Maybe this is taking too long. Maybe I should stop expecting so much. Maybe I should just lower the emotional investment a bit. That's what makes it so subtle. Because on the outside, you may still be doing the right things. You may still be showing up. You may still be following the routine. You may still be moving forward. But internally, something starts to thin out. The care starts to thin out. The hunger starts to thin out. The seriousness starts to thin out. And if you are not paying attention, discouragement can make you gradually loosen your grip on the very things that got you this far. This is something I've had to be honest about. Continuing is not always the same as building well. Sometimes you can keep going physically while pulling back emotionally. And in some ways, that is more dangerous than stopping loudly. Because at least if you stop loudly, you can confront it, you can name it, you can deal with it. But when you keep going with less care, it can hide inside what looks like responsibility. You still take the next step. You still do the work. But the work starts to become flatter, more mechanical, less intentional, less alive. And when something important becomes too mechanical, the quality of it changes. Not immediately, but over time. That's why I'm paying attention to this now. Because I don't want to confuse movement with health. I don't want to confuse routine with conviction. And I definitely don't want to let discouragement reduce the quality of what I'm building while I tell myself, at least I'm still going. One of the first things discouragement threatens is discipline. Not discipline in the obvious sense, not necessarily breaking all the rules or doing something reckless. More like a thinning, a softening. The edge goes a little dull. The sharpness weakens slightly. You start letting small things slide. You stop bringing the same seriousness to the process. You start accepting a lower standard because part of you feels tired of expecting more. That's the kind of thing I want to guard against, because discipline is not just about avoiding failure. It is about protecting quality. It is about protecting seriousness. It is about staying aligned, even when the emotional reward is still low. And that becomes especially important in long seasons. Because when visible progress is limited, discipline is one of the only things stopping the journey from turning into slow drift. That's what discouragement wants, really. Not always destruction. Sometimes just drift. A quieter version of compromise. A version where you don't abandon the build. You just stop honoring it fully. The other thing discouragement threatens is faith. And again, not always dramatically, not always in some big crisis of belief. More quietly than that. Faith can start going quiet. Prayer becomes thinner. Expectation becomes weaker. You still believe in principle, but your inner posture becomes more guarded, less open, less trusting, almost as if part of you starts protecting itself from disappointment by emotionally stepping back. I think that's a real temptation, because when you've been believing for something for a long time and the visible outcome still hasn't fully arrived, part of you wants to protect your heart. So instead of doubting loudly, you just lower the emotional investment. You stop leaning in as much. You stop asking with the same confidence. You stop carrying the same sense that God is bringing this to fruition. And that is dangerous too, because faith is not just a comforting extra in this journey. It is part of the structure. It is part of what keeps me steady. It is part of what stops the waiting from feeling meaningless. So if faith starts going quiet, the whole journey starts feeling heavier. I think long seasons do something very revealing. They expose what is really holding you up. When things move quickly, you can live off excitement for a while. When breakthroughs come easily, hope feels effortless. When progress is obvious, belief feels almost automatic. But long seasons are different. Long seasons expose whether your commitment is built on visible reward or deeper conviction. They expose whether your discipline only works when encouraged. They expose whether your faith only feels strong when outcomes are close enough to touch. And that's uncomfortable, but it's also useful. Because I would rather discover now what discouragement is trying to erode than realize later that I let something important weaken quietly for months. That's what I mean when I say I'm protective right now. I'm not only trying to protect outcomes, I'm trying to protect what makes the outcomes possible. What I'm really fighting for in this season is not just continuation, it's wholehearted continuation. That matters, because there is a version of building where you stay in motion but lose your heart. And I don't want that. I don't want to become the kind of person who still says the right things, still does the right routines, still technically keeps going, but has quietly disconnected from the seriousness of the call. I want to stay engaged. I want to stay clear. I want to stay spiritually alive inside the build. Not perfect, not emotionally intense every day, but present, real, intentional. Because what I'm building matters too much to be handled carelessly. And the older I get, the more I realize that protecting the inside of the journey matters just as much as protecting the outside of it. So what does this actually look like for me? Honestly, I think it starts with naming discouragement earlier, not waiting until it grows, not pretending it's just tiredness every time, not excusing every low-hearted day as normal. Sometimes it is just tiredness. Sometimes it is just life. But sometimes it is discouragement trying to slowly reduce the quality of my engagement. And I need to be honest enough to catch that. Then I need to respond properly, not by panicking, not by trying to create fake motivation, but by returning to what matters. Prayer, consistency, simple obedience, doing the next right thing with intention. Reminding myself that I do not need visible payoff in order for the process to still matter. And reminding myself that discipline and faith do not need to feel loud in order to be strong. Sometimes they are strong precisely because they stay steady when nothing around them feels dramatic. If I had to put it simply, this is what I'm protecting right now. I'm protecting my discipline from becoming thin, and I'm protecting my faith from becoming quiet. Because if those two things stay healthy, then the build stays healthy. Not easy, not fast, not instantly rewarding, but healthy. And healthy things can survive long seasons. Healthy things can survive silence. Healthy things can survive delay. That's what I want. I don't need fake momentum. I don't need emotional hype. I need the core of this thing to stay strong. And right now, that means guarding the parts that discouragement would most love to slowly wear down. Not the dream itself, the foundations underneath it. I think one of the strangest things about discouragement is that it doesn't always try to stop you. Sometimes it just tries to make you care less. Less about the process, less about the standard, less about prayer. And that's why I'm paying attention to it now. Because in this season, the two things I cannot afford to let weaken are my discipline and my faith. If those stay strong, the build stays alive. If those stay protected, then even a long season can still produce something solid. And maybe that's part of maturity too. Not just knowing what you're building, but knowing what you have to protect while you build it. I'm JP, and I'll see you in the next one.